is not what you know, it's what you can prove.
You know how to cut to the core of me, Baxter. You're so wise. You're like a miniature Buddha, covered in hair.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. Rule number 1. No touching of the hair or face.
Of course.
And that's it! Now let's do this!
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 141 of the Golf Guru Show. I am your host, Jason Sutton, Director of Instruction at the beautiful Colleton River Club in Bluffton, South Carolina, where it is my mission to break down high performers in the teaching and coaching business, as well as all fields of study. Make sure that you download this episode and all episodes of the Golf Guru Show and hit that purple subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future episodes that will be coming your way. All I ask is that you share the podcast on social and with other coaches and players that might benefit from this information. My guest this week is Dr. Mike K. Make sure you follow Mike on Instagram at Mike_K_DPT. As we've discussed, the absolute worst Instagram handle ever. We'll have to get him to change that. But great follow, super smart guy, as he has some new projects coming out soon that you might want to explore or follow along with. A little bit about Mike. He is a PT movement specialist that works with athletes on the PGA Tour and also works with players in MLB and is located in Phoenix, Arizona, where is his home base. I recently met Mike at the Doctors For seminar as we stayed in the same house. So we immediately connected and had some incredible talks after hours, which is always the best. The goal of this talk is to not think that us swing coaches can do everything or see everything that Mike does, because that would be impossible, but to understand the brilliance of what he does and possibly seek out a movement expert specialist like Dr. Mike K to assist your players as part of your team. If you're working with elite or tour players, as I have done, as we have collaborated and helped one of my tour players understand the origin of where his pain was coming from and how he can train to strengthen those areas, which has been super helpful. In this conversation, we cover a broad spectrum of topics, which was incredible, which include his framework and how he operates with his clients, to what he has learned from using force plates like SwingCat, and a lot more about golf swings and just human movement in general. There's a lot to be gleaned from this really cool combo with my guy that I have nicknamed the Wizard, and I hope that sticks because I think he is a wizard and is an incredible dude and also very, very good at what he does. So enjoy this conversation with my friend, Dr. Mike K. Dr. Mike K, welcome to the pod, man. Welcome to the show. I appreciate you taking the time. I'm really excited to kind of get into it because you're such a different part of what we've had on the show, being a PT / whatever else you do. I love that. I listened to a podcast that you were on and you said the greatest thing is when they walk in and like they don't really know what you do. I think that's a huge compliment. Thanks for being on.
Yeah, no, I appreciate having me. We met out in Virginia and I thought we got along right away.
Yes.
You'd be a dude that I could hang and talk with. Yeah. So I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Let's start with your path, right? Because I mean, again, to kind of give the listeners a little bit of context. And after doing the research on you and your background, I found it interesting that you majored in English and wanted to become a lawyer. Is that true? And then like, how did that come to an end? And take us on that journey a little bit.
So I played every sport growing up, mostly baseball, a little tennis, stuff like that. A lot of rotational sports, and picked up golf a little bit later. But it's sort of like you go to college, went to college and played baseball, and then they look at your schedule and like, what do you want to do? I'm like, I like to read. They're like, all right, you could be an English major. And then before you know it, you're a couple years in and you're pot committed, right? Like, I'm not turning around now. And then you realize you're not going to be playing baseball at the next level. And they say, what do you like to do? And they're like, well, you're kind of a jerk. You're kind of a dick. You like to argue with people. Yeah. It's like, I'll be a lawyer.
When I read that, I'm like, this makes perfect sense. So like, you would have been a fantastic litigator.
Yeah, I like to argue and just take sides for no reason, just to annoy people. But then I clerked for a summer and realized I was like, this is not necessarily what I thought it was going to be. So then I went back to school, looking around at some sort of health profession. PT stood out as something that I could see myself doing and doing the shadowing and talking to people. I think that's a theme through what I've done through my life and my career, is that I will find someone that I like or seems interesting and just reach out to them and not be like, hey, tell me stuff, and be like, I try to offer them things and be nice and like be a normal human being, not be like, tell me and feed me.
So how would you describe your job now? This is always interesting. Me and Steve, our mutual friend Steve Moore, tried to like describe you, and we had, I think, different takes. So it'd be interesting to hear from you.
I'm a physical therapist by trade, right? I operate under a PT license. So it's kind of nice that it gives me an ability to touch people, put my hands on people, and then have sort of a medical background. But I think day-to-day process, I feel like my niche is sort of in between the swing coach and then the action of the player, or the pitching coach or whatever. I can communicate in both languages. I can wear both hats, but I'm pretty decent at physiologically understanding what the swing coach or the pitching coach or the hitting coach might want to see, and then communicating that with the player. I work really well with coaches. I don't really work great with other PTs, but other coaches.
Yeah.
I love talking to coaches, but other PTs, depends on the PT.
Yeah, we figured that out, right? We will keep that under our hat. Obviously, we met at Doctors For, and immediately I was sort of drawn to probably the opposite of me, which is you're the ultimate contrarian. You call it being an asshole, but it's like, I think that's a really good trait because you're always questioning things, right? It's like, okay, prove it. You think that's good? Okay, prove it. That's a good workout. Like you see a tour player doing something, you're like, okay, why is that good? The why, I think, is a great place for us to always start. And I know you've navigated through a lot of rabbit holes and things that you're doing now to get to where you are. And I think there's so many parallels to what I do and then what you do. But as we've sort of figured out, is like the collaboration of both of us is like amazing, right? So that's why I think you probably mirror a lot of our characteristics as swing coaches and being curious and whatnot. The question is like, where did that contrarian questioning everything come from?
I guess it's kind of innate, right? But then it gets also then probably I have parents that would also question me as well, right? I have 2 little girls right now, and my older one is, yesterday I literally had to be like, I need 20 minutes of no questions from you. Like,
they're going to be just like you, dude. You can't avoid it.
I need a 20-minute break of whys, right? You just keep asking whys until you get to the most fundamental thing of something. And if you have the discipline to do that and not just blow smoke up your ass and like, oh, I found the why behind this, you keep going until you see something at the fundamental level of ones and zeros behind something might be working.
Yeah. I described you as like the Swiss Army knife of human movement.
I appreciate that. If you asked me 5 years ago or 6 years ago where I would hope I would be heading, and that's kind of it. I feel comfortable if you showed me a cricket bowler or pick a random sport, knowing some of the context, I could probably do a decent job of breaking down what's going on and why something may or may not be advantageous to what they're trying to do.
Do you have any pickleball clients yet?
I did.
No way.
Hey, it's Scottsdale.
It's huge at Carlton River. Like, it's crazy. I'm getting like pickleball questions now. There's pickleball pros.
Yeah. I looked at one pickleball video on Instagram, and all I get are like these amazing pickleball rallies.
Exactly.
Things that just never end.
Unbelievable. So after literally day 2 at Doctors For, like, you've got to look at one of my guys, right? So one of my tour players had some wrist and forearm pain. We FaceTimed him and he did a couple little screens. And then you were nice enough to be involved in one of our lessons, which was amazing. Being able to size somebody up that quickly, and you gave him answers. That's really what he wanted, was like, okay, why is this happening? Because it's been a couple of years and he's seen multiple PTs and experts and doctors. And then you gave him a couple of exercises and immediately it sort of changed his pattern, right? Stuff that we've been trying to work on. I really appreciate you doing that. And hopefully we can continue to collaborate on some stuff. Cause like I've talked about you probably more since I've been back from Doctors For than any other swing coach that I've ever met. And I've used the word compression probably more than any time that I've ever.
You say the word compression, people are like, oh, I know what that means, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I want to compress the golf ball. I'm like, no. That's not what I'm talking about. It was interesting. I'm going to read a quote that I read in one of your interviews. It says, things aren't black and white in the structure of the human body. Look through the perspective of whether a person can expand or compress, and contextually what they need to do in sport and life. It seems like that's a big part of your framework. So use those words, compression and expansion, a lot. So go through your principles of these concepts and it'll kind of lead us into what creates human movement.
I think if you think of this from like a base, pure inhale and exhale, my ability to take a full inhale and a full exhale is going to be a prerequisite for me to demonstrate the most amount of socket positions that I can and axial skeletons, so spinal positions that I can. So inhalation being biased towards expansion, space, external rotations, and then the opposite being exhalation would be like compression, internal rotation. So everything then compressing together, right? So you need both sides of the coin, and having the ability to access both sides of the coin is kind of what allows us to create shapes and space in order to move the directions that we're trying to move. I think we look at the body as too much of like a rigid structure where I don't play the favorite tissue game, right? Fascia, ligament, I don't care. It's all the same stuff and it just acts differently in different contexts. So like, I think where I might sound a little bit crazy is that I would consider bone just another connective tissue, right? And that's a big component of all of this. It's in the literature, it's in the research, you just have to have an eye to get it. It's all
different lens, right? I mean, that's the thing. Talking to you, we had a lot of late night discussions, which kind of blew my mind. You had like the whole house on the floor doing different things and like making them move differently. And I'm sitting there, I mean, we'll get into the golf swing stuff, obviously, but how you're able to change patterns by some simple exercises and then breathing through those exercises, I thought was really fascinating.
This kind of ties into everything we're seeing with force plate data or whatever. When everyone, it's in the baseball world, it's everywhere. People are looking at the large magnitude things, large magnitude forces, more force, better. But I think we miss the small setups to allow those large forces to occur. That's, why laying on your side and breathing a certain way might then allow you to produce force more efficiently. Like, I don't really care about the total force you produce. I want a time component. I want a direction. And then I can start to care about the amount of force that you're producing.
Yeah. And we'll get into that, what you're doing with Swing Cat. And I want to know some of the things that you've learned from that. Before we do that, I want something we talked about one of those evenings is, and that's something I think will help the swing coaches, is I want to be using the correct language and understanding the correct language anatomically, because we're kind of throwing around terms like internal and external rotation. You seem to have a different idea of like what that means. Like if you were just talking to a room full of swing coaches and describe internal and external rotation, and we can nail it down to like, say, the pelvis, because we always talk about the pelvis and then the shoulders, right? It's like internal or external. How would you help the coaches make sure that they're understanding that?
If you look back at the old school, like PNF patterns, which they were 100% right, like anyone interested in this stuff, I would go back and look at the old school, like Kabat and Voss, whatever, like the early PNF stuff. They're doing these patterns for stroke and recovery, things like this. But essentially what they are is like a flexion, abduction, and then like external rotation. So literally like lifting my arm straight up over my head. Let's say it's like people would call this straight plane flexion. When in reality, I'm creating external rotation on internal rotation in parts of my body. So in order for me to literally get my arm overhead, we just see the straight plane motion, but we don't take into account that it's actually, there's a point when my body is like literally turning away and then turning back in and then turning back away from that arm in order to get myself into some certain space. External rotation is just anything that's going to externally rotate is going to bias a position of expansion, and anything that's going to internally rotate is going to bias a position of compression. Flexion would be external rotation biased, where extension would be internally rotation biased. Like horizontal, like shoulder adduction is internal rotation. We just like to make up like these imaginary lines and planes. We're going to say, this is straight plane flexion. There's no such thing as straight plane flexion. I'm at setup over the ball. The moment I start to move at all, we just make up a line and stand saying, oh, is it the plane off the ball, or is my sacrum starting to move? Like, where is the actual plane that I'm moving off of? And it's not just a point of just being contentious, being like, technically, that's not correct. Then it leads to poor exercise design. It leads to like a misunderstanding of communication with the athlete too, where innately flexion doesn't have any, I don't know what that means. But if you start telling me about like some compression or expansion, can you feel the space opening here? To me, that's some of the powerful things of being able to communicate with someone in that way. It seems to be helpful.
Yeah, I guess what I'm kind of getting at is more the direction that something's moving.
Yeah.
Is like if the trail hip is moving backwards, is that internal or external rotation?
It depends on the point of the movement.
That's where I get confused, right? It's like it can be a little bit of both, right? Left hip, right hip, just rotate or what, right?
That's a universal principle, is this superposition. Things are happening at the same time. They have to happen at the same time in order for meaningful motion to occur. So if I start to take the club away and I see a foot that rolls to the outside or the guy peg leg his knee right away, I know that he's creating like this external rotation bias. But as soon as I create that ER bias, I have to create some sort of down force internal rotation into the ground, which typically is like, this is going to be hard to repeat over and over again. So I'm looking at forces cancel. As soon as the club breaks away and the hip starts to turn a little bit, I'm creating an ER bias, but I have to start producing down force on top of that. So it's a combination of both of those things happening at one point in time. When the club gets sort of the top and I have to start turning around, I'm going to be more of an internally rotated biased right side, right hip, depending on how I created that turn.
That's what's difficult. Like we've used different language that probably more, I mean, I use it a little bit with my students depending on the player, but it's more like coach to coach, right? It's like, how are we communicating? Like if we were on the phone, like what are we talking about, right? I think it's important to start to nail those down a little bit. And it gets a little messy, I think, as far as what people perceive as internal and external.
If I'm in a full right turn into my right side, right?
Right hip, what would that be? Internal or external?
It would be both.
Okay. Thanks. That helps me a lot.
It would be both, right?
Okay.
But you have to think about like the shape of the pelvis. It has to, in order to change shape, and sort of the femur can make a turn into a certain position here. We don't have the range of motion that we think we have.
Mm-hmm.
We're evolved to walk, right? There's not much requirement for range of motion when you're actually walking. It's very little. When we look at like what someone's hip flexion might be. So if I put you on your back and I take your knee all the way to your chest and say like, well, he's got full hip flexion. But in reality, it's like you roll to the outside, you rolled back on me, right? The relative motion in the hip is not as much as we think it is. It becomes then connective tissue, twisting and turning. There's a lot happening underneath the skin that we don't account for.
Yeah, I think that's where it's like, that's where you're so good. Like, I wish I had you like in my back pocket every lesson. Or could be like, all right, tag. Go get this guy to move a little bit better, right? So this is what I need. Moving on to like what we talked a little bit about at Doctors for, you know, mutated sacrums and buttholes and guts. It's like, what did he talk about? A lot of buttholes and guts. And then, you know, you gave me a little lesson. You actually sprinkled some foo-foo dust on me, and like I actually grew an ass, which was pretty awesome. But I think I like the way you guys, like you and Quan and Dr. Bull, and I don't know how much time you guys have spent together as far as like you and Dr. Bull, but you kind of flowed nicely with creating energy, right? And you call it like, I love the fact that you talked about creating the wave. Talk a little bit about that, and, you know, we'll kind of migrate into golf swings, obviously, but it's just human movement, right? It's like, talk about the wave, because I thought that was such a great, and you had the, what do you call the wave, little training aid you were swinging around?
The water bag?
Yeah, the water bag. Like, that was so cool. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
I think when you use this sort of lens model, the model that I'm trying to incorporate is that you're just trying to figure out the direction that energy is traveling. And it's not, whenever anyone says energy, it becomes woo-woo. You get that as eye rolls. But in reality, that's essentially what's happening, right? This is old school Newton, right? I put my foot on the ground. It's got to push back into me, right? And if we could see, we can kind of see this stuff, like when you watch things at really, really high speed and you can see like ripples going through someone, especially like at a pitcher, watching them at thousands of frames per second, you can see the bend and the twist and then the wave moving through them. So energy propagates via wave. It's like the sound waves that you're hearing are basically compressions and expansions that allows this thing to move, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't hear it, right? It wouldn't travel. The same thing would happen inside us, right? It's like as I hit the ground or as I'm pushing, I'm having these ripples in the pond will travel through you. And depending on the context, depending on the body structure, and depending on a lot of stuff, I may or may not get a wave to travel in a certain direction that's going to be meaningful at any certain time, if that makes sense.
Definitely. The listeners are going to be like, what the heck, right? What's going on?
You can feel this, right? Like, think of a day when you felt the most springy and the most athletic, and or like that felt easy and I squared that thing up. That was a bullet and I didn't feel like I put that much effort into it, right? To me, that's a sense of like, that's a well-timed energy wave that's traveling through you. Because once I shoot that gun, once the bullet leaves the chamber, that thing's traveling. And you can do all you want to try to redirect things and side bend and create some of these like orientations to try to control it. But that wave is traveling through you. And I don't think you want the degree of muscle activity that would be required to try to travel, to try to control that thing. It's got to travel.
It's like how much of the human body is made up of water? A lot.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've heard that before. It's like that makes perfect sense. We're trying to get people to move. And then I'm a big hands-on guy. My style is to put my hands on people, move them around. But now it's like after spending time with you, I'm like, all right, now you need to breathe through this. Can you feel that? Like I'm starting to feel things differently of like people that are compressed or getting them to open up a little bit more. And it's been pretty interesting to see. The first time I heard some of that from a golf instructor was Scott Cowks. And he said, it's kind of like yoga, right? It's like, why do they ask you to breathe while you're changing positions or doing different poses, right? It's the same thing. We're creating motion. We're creating elasticity in the muscles or whatever we're trying to accomplish in the change. And it doesn't work real good when you hold your breath and you kind of lock up, right?
Yeah, so it squeezes the gradient. I need a gradient in order to move. There's another universal principle. Like nothing moves without some bit of gradient. If I can't take a full inhale and a full exhale, then I don't have maybe the requirement of the gradient to move the energy through my system at any given time. Now, there are times when you don't want a gradient, like when you want things to stop, like I would say like near the top of the golf swing, I need things to turn around so that things should be winded and twisted there. What people run into trouble is when they've already created the winding, twisting before their hands have even left their base of support. Now you're in twist orientation land the rest of your golf swing.
Yeah, there's got to be some braking, right, to transfer energy out into the club.
100%.
Like we've talked about.
Arms parallel downswing.
For speed and whatnot. One of the questions that we talked a little bit about, and I just love how you're so observant of like looking at players. Like I'm just looking at golfers, and we talked about Colin Morikawa's like the position of his eyes and the way his pelvis is going to be the same alignment, but also how tour players are really in the last, I guess, since Tiger really started lifting heavy, doing a lot of workouts that probably football players would do or baseball players. And like, what's your view on that? Because it seems like the guys look fitter, right? They look better in clothes, but they're getting hurt a lot more. Is there a correlation to that?
If my job is to rotate and spin, I need to rotate, right? That is the premium. If you think of like a figure skater, right? If I want to spin in a tight circle, I get in a nice oval. If I want to slow down, I get wide. The stronger I get and the better I get at lifting weights, I actually then squeeze myself front to back. So pecs, lats, butt, all those sort of things. What it ends up doing is it ends up making me kind of a wider individual. When it does that, it makes me a little bit wider, and then I end up squeezing me in like my socket position. So I just don't have necessarily the turns that I might have before. So it squeezes your gradient available. Will that create more speed? Very likely, right? It's going to help you create speed. Are there other ways to do it without giving up your turns? That's where I would differ with a lot of guys, right? So the argument I get back with people all the time, well, Torp, they're just going to have shorter careers now. Their guys are going to be like 5-6 years. And I'd say that's horseshit. What's the difference between a 185 ball speed and 178, 179 and me then having an entire array of shots? Is there that much difference?
Probably not. There's a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, there's an inverted U curve on this ball speed chase. And the further I go to the other side of the U, I will lose my ability to hit 40, 50-yard shots. You just can't have them both. The further I go into that range of like, all right, I need to chase ball speed, what it ends up doing is to pull the lawnmower harder and harder in order to start myself moving. And then good luck hitting a 70-yard shot when you have to do that. That becomes more and more difficult. But like as for like the liftings, I think it's an easy story to tell someone that the problem with you is that you're just not strong. Like it's a weakness thing. If I hurt, it's weak. If it's my rotator cuff test weak, then it's because it's actually weak. When it's not really, rotator cuff's never really actually weak. It's just in a position that it can't respond in, right? And then think what's required for a golf shot or golf swing anyways, right? I mean, the impulse of what I'm producing force is very quick. The implement is pretty damn light. Do you need a certain amount of strength to play golf? Yeah. But do you need it to the level that I'm going to run into another human being? No.
What was your thoughts like when you saw Bryson kind of going through his transformation?
This was what I would like, not to pat myself, because I'm wrong all the time. But this is what we would expect. You cannot cancel out all of your turns and then just rely on one thing. And you're going to destroy labrums, right? All these sort of
You got to get a hurt wrist.
Yeah, of course. Like, where are you going to get your turn from? The fluid doesn't get distributed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea is like, all right, we're going to put breadcrumbs down so that we can come back from this. It's not the way this works. Sorry.
Sounds great. on paper.
Yeah, it does, right? You're like, but this is not a complex adaptive. That's not complex adaptive system. That's me getting lost in the woods and being able to find my way back. But what if the woods changes and turns around before I'm able to come back? That's what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with the same path there and back.
Yeah, that's a deep hole. You've spoke about one of your mentors, or maybe your main mentor, Bill Hartman. Is that his name?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what did you learn from him that sort of helped you on your journey? Any things you could share?
If anyone's heard about like the infrasternal angle stuff, this is his idea, like him looking at like being able to bucket human beings according to their shape and size and like what they're going to be good at. He's done an amazing job at looking at this from a true first principle perspective, right? When most people, they start talking about first principles, and you just see like all they end up doing is talking about like strength. And that's a nothing word. It means absolutely nothing. Or mobility, which means nothing. Stability is a useless word. Like these words that we've just repeated for the last 15, 20 years, and we needed it, but we have to start thinking about like this in a more advanced way. Because when I say stability, people just think like, oh, I just have to stand still and squeeze, right? Literally, to move, you have to become unstable, instable, destabilized. You have to destabilize to move.
That's the golf swing. It's basically trying not to fall down, swinging a club at 110 miles an hour.
So then, okay, then I need to be stronger in order to support these certain things. And you could be the strongest person in the world. And if you're out of position because you don't have the space to move into, you look really weak really quickly. There's a lot of really strong guys that can't control the face and they have to flip at it. It's not a strength thing. You can do all the form flexing exercises you want, and it's not going to matter. Bill is the strangest guy in the world and the kindest guy in the world. He's bizarre as you would imagine him to be, but he's the real deal. He's the guy that consults with a ton of stuff behind the scenes, a lot of things. He's up every morning early, and he's in his little office doing the same stuff for 3 or 4 hours every morning, right? He's the guy who's put together 2 or 3 hours of deep work for 15, 20 years, and you get the thought process that he's been able to share.
What does that look like without getting into your morning routine? But like, what do you mean deep work? Like, what is he doing for those 3 or 4 hours?
He's in his office and nothing distracts him.
What's that like?
Yeah, I don't know.
The guy not have a phone? What's going on?
He's very good at like putting together actual uninterrupted stuff and just doing the same thing over and over again for a lot of years. He'll tell you he's pretty boring, but I think he's so far ahead of everyone. Every time I get to talk to him, I'm like, wow, that's amazing what you're talking about there. And it takes me, a month, and I come back to him I'm like, is this conceptually yes, no, or try this? Like, what are you thinking here? I'll send him a video of someone and he responds back to me. What stands out to you? I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, he turns it right back on you, right?
Yeah.
As a good mentor should.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a ton of evals in front of him, and I'm well into my career and felt pretty vulnerable, dumb, not knowing what he's talking about in front of another client. He's a good guy. He's a kind guy. He's a really good mentor.
Super cool. I mean, it's just like in my space as well. It's like you get people that challenge you, make you think. It's all the above. A couple of bullet points here that I've made note of I want you to comment on that I found in an interview that you did. One is the biggest mistakes rotational sports athletes and coaches make in designing a program. And we've talked a little bit about that, I guess, from the weightlifting part, but it doesn't have to be long. But how would you comment on that?
I guess not having performance indicators. What are you going to come back and measure repeatedly on someone? And it doesn't have to be on the table from a golf coach or a strength coach or even a PT or whatever. You should have something that you think is, all right, if we get this in line, then this is going to help his performance should increase. And coming back to that repeatedly and being honest with it and be like, all right, well, I thought hip extension would be the thing that gets him to stand up less the top of this swing. But apparently I'm not quite gathering what I need. Stuff like that. I think it's always going to be like, what's your performance indicator for the guy? And not tracking it, not being adaptable enough with the program when you know something might not be working, and then taking ownership of it, right? Too many times people say like, well, I did my job, and it's on this person.
Yeah, you got to be able to pivot, right? I deal with that all the time with my players. It's like, all right, well, this isn't working. And you got to be eloquent about it. Maybe not to make yourself look completely stupid, but let's scrap that. And a lot of times, I mean, I think the honesty goes a long way, right? For the relationship with the client.
You don't know until you start.
Yeah.
And not enough people start. I get that question all the time. How do you know where? I was like, I don't know. I've messed up a lot. But it's being able to track and understand like, all right, this is where I'll go, having an idea. You have to have the guts to start and then realize that this is not going to be a straight line process.
That's the tough part, is knowing when to change and when to pivot and when to give up and say, all right, let's go a different path. But that's what makes you great. And that's what makes a lot of coaches great, is like having that ability to screw up and then figure out, when this isn't working. One of the interesting points that I heard you say was the importance of developing observational skills, right? And I think this can be applicable to all trades, especially our jobs. Are there any tips or tactics for that? Or is it just time spent looking at things in a different way or a different lens?
You need the reps, purposeful reps, like anything else. And then you need a representative model of movement for your context of what you're looking at. I don't think you can record and rewatch things enough. That's where I probably will differ with some people. I think 2D gets crapped on a lot, just like a video. Like if I move this way a little bit, then it completely changes the position of it. Maybe, but then if you look at it from like a shape position, or where like a sense of where this person's center of mass is at any time, it shouldn't change the perspective, right? The club might look a little different, but the observational skills is reps. It's having a representative model of motion and then repeating it and then trying stuff to see what changes, what doesn't. I mean, I still do it. In my office, I have a big computer screen. I'll throw up 3 videos and like, this is after I did this is after I did this, this is after I did this. And looking at things I missed in the moment, like, oh, that was actually better, or that made that worse, or this is the direction I want to go. You have to review this stuff a lot.
2D still has a lot of context, in my opinion, and I use it with radar and with 3D or whatever, but it's like still movement is movement, right? We all have biases, but I like the one conversation you had with one of your colleagues there. He said, bias allows us to make decisions, right? It's like, if not, you just be like not saying anything. That was kind of cool. Like, yeah, you can say you don't have a model all you want as a golf coach, but you do have a bias, right? On what we like to see. And then you sort of go off on tangents and figure out what works. And that's what the good ones do. This is kind of off the wall here, but what is Sturgeon's Law?
Jeez, that is basically like the majority of any profession is garbage. That kind of breaks it down.
Perfect.
Like 95% of what you see. I'm sure there's other accountants that look at other accountants, but that guy's dog shit. Like, look at his lines. You're going to see that in the PT profession, right? And every profession has their, like, I'm sure you walk up on a lesson tee and you're like, oh, my God.
Oh, yeah.
I'll walk into a clinic and be like,
I'm going to use that more often. Yeah, it's a Sturgeon's Law on the saturation of the fitness industry. That was one of the bullets.
Yeah.
All right, so let's kind of get into the golf swing stuff. I think, as you're trying to, like you said, sort of overlap, as well as we're all trying to like figure out what the heck you're doing, right? It's like, that's why we're such a good team. And we've spent some time looking at force plate data and some of your students that you're working with and how you've changed them with some of your exercises and whatnot. Like any discoveries, I guess, as far as like what you've noticed using that measuring device that surprised you. And I want to get into like different shape golfers as well.
I think like the swing cap stuff has been conformational. 3D stuff has been conformational. Not to say that I wouldn't have been able to tell you numbers, but even like I was showing Bill, for example, some swing cat stuff a couple weeks ago. This is cool. This is the early IR stuff we've been talking about. He looks at me with his glass. He's like, are you surprised? And I was like, I guess not. He's like, yeah. I remember I was sitting by a couple golf coaches like 3 years ago, and they were talking about like, well, if we can figure out what the forces are happening in the hands, then we can figure out everything. And just thinking like, it's no different than what's happening at the feet. It's the same exact forces. The timing is just different. That's too much of what we do is we just separate being like, we see a foot doctor and then we see a hip doctor. And like, yes, if you're going to have surgery, you need specialties of understanding very intricate anatomy, but it's the same thing. Like a hip is a shoulder. Part of your tibia is actually part of like your sacrum, these things. Like your tibia matches what the club is doing.
Yeah, that's the cool stuff.
This is a fundamental thing in nature, like patterns repeat, right? And there are replicative patterns that are repeated throughout the body that if you understand how like a joint works, and you can pretty much understand how pretty much everything starts to work in the body. Because it's no different. There's not new rules for everything. We couldn't make new rules for everything. It'd be too complicated.
Yeah. So we talked about at the seminar, the difference between different shapes, right? People. Narrow golfers versus wide golfers like myself that are hopefully going to be narrow in 6 months.
I hate to break it to you, but you'll never change. You're always going to be a wide guy.
That was my question, is like, when I become a narrow, is my swing going to change?
Just like me, I will always be the skinny kid. Yeah. And then I got strong and I was like, look, I could do 10 pull-ups and got strong.
But I always have better hair than you.
That is true. You will always have hair. It's always the envy of like the grass is green. I'd much rather be a wide than a rip,
I don't know, man. I love to look like you. So go through the like characteristics that we discussed. A narrow golfer, and this is not hard and fast, obviously, but let's just say in the backswing, what they tend to do and how can they utilize that?
Yeah, so a narrow is going to be more biased towards external rotation, inhalation type stuff. So they're going to have a greater ability to demonstrate a full spectrum of movement. So if like both ends of the spectrum of movement, so we call it like ER to IR to ER, they have the full spectrum. But their internal rotation is going to be shorter. So they're not going to have the ability to produce force for an extended period of time, same period of time like a wide would. So wide won't have the ability to demonstrate like end range mobility, but they're going to be able to produce force for a longer period of time. So, I mean, you got your Kenyan marathon runner and you've got your power lifter from Russia. So those are like the two very different types of people. Golfer wise, I think Justin Thomas.
I was going to say, I've used an example. Yeah, there you go. JT versus Rahm would be a much different mover.
Yeah, so you got a guy that's going to be like, I would expect early in the takeaway, the club to stay down a little longer on the wide. They're going to be a little more inside early relative to what, I don't know, where the narrow is going to be up and more vertical quicker. So the wide is going to have a center of gravity that should be down and back more. So they're going to have more of a nutated sacrum. So the backside of their pelvis and the backside of their ass should be more open. When they get compressed, they're not going to be able to drop back there, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
The narrow is going to be opposite. They're not going to have the backside of their pelvis open to the degree that a wide would. So they're going to produce force from more of like the front of their foot. So as the club moves away, they're going to create more of an impulse through like the ball of their foot. Not that you want them to lose their heel, but they're not going to have access to the deep internal rotation in the backside of the foot that like a wide would have. So they're going to have a more vertical plane shaft as it goes up. On the way down, a narrow is going to be more of like a single leg jumper when you talk about like how they're going to produce force, and the wide will be more of a double limb jumper just because of the size of their pelvis and rib cage.
Yeah, because you mentioned like JT, if he had tried to fix his right foot action, like he would suck. He has to do that for a reason.
Narrows get into trouble. Someone sent me a video of him the other day, but it's like when a narrow gets compressed because their center mass is already up and forward. So they really can't go up and forward anymore. So when they start to get compressed and lose movement options, you'll see them as they take the club away. You'll see that quick early like left shoulder dive, chin head go down.
Yeah, like my guy.
They're trying to create some downforce really quickly. But then it's, think about afterwards, right? It spills everything forward. Those guys tend to get across. Like JT's always trying to get his hand path deeper, all those sort of things. So you end up getting a little too vertical, a little too across.
Yeah. And I think the starting position, right? Like talk about postural biases, I guess, for each player. And I did have a question about what do you enjoy as far as, and then this is going into your golfing now lens, is like what kind of posture do you like to see each of them have to take advantage of their shape?
I want to see a narrow in more of like a squat-ish setup versus a wide is going to be more like a hinge type setup.
Hips are back more and a little more forward bend. And
then like a little more of like a vertical tibia in the wide, and a narrow is going to maybe have a little bit more of a positive shin angle. That's subtle. But from a perspective of like, if I see a narrow that's been told to hinge hard, what you'll end up typically seeing is they won't have the ability to create the shape change in the like sacrum area. So they can't create a true nutated sacrum. So what they do is they take the entire pelvis as a unit and they just dump it down towards the ground. And so the way they did that is they take L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, and they point those down on the ground, which dumps the pelvis forward, which creates like the hinge look for your narrow. Before I take the club away, I'm already creating that amount of compression. Good luck, right? I don't think that's going to be advantageous to the direction that they need to move the golf club in. You could probably picture guys that have gotten hurt that have had that sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. You seem to be really kind of big on how that energy starts early, right? And we talk about that with pressure. Pressure starts to shift before the club moves. This is something we as coaches have discovered, obviously with SwingCat or Body Tracker or whatever you're using. You tend to be more, I guess, one piece, for lack of a better term, with the takeaway to where the energy is coming from body, hands, and arms and club. Would that be fair? And you always say catch it, like, and then you can catch it. Going back to my guy that we worked with, tends to like stand the club up pretty quick. Things were a little bit disjointed, and he even felt that in his swing. That's more of a personal preference, but I know that there's going to be different styles of takeaways.
What I've been keying in on a lot recently too is just those like down the line shot in the first like 3 inches, 2 inches off the ball. So you'll see like the club face kick up and go out away from the ball really quickly. If I don't have them on a force plate, I just know that they're not creating any early like trail side hip IR torque catch. So the moment they produce force down to the ground, it's pushing the club up and away from them. You're creating an early like ER orientation up and away. So that's all that is. It's like I produce force and the club gets shoved away from me. I own that space the club is going. So now I have to have a face that's going to capture that energy. So then I have to IR or shut the face in order to catch that right away. You can swing really, really hard doing that. I'm not saying that you can't play great.
A lot of players have done it.
A lot of people have done it, right? That's always my selling point to anyone. It's like, I just want to make this easier for you. If shoving the club 3 inches off the ball on the first 3 inches of takeaway and I have to keep the face shut and all those sort of things makes it really difficult. And then you're already twisting. You're already going to be twisting through your upper cervical spine.
Yeah.
I worry about injury stuff really quickly with that move.
Yeah. How much time are you spending rehabbing your clients versus training them? Or you probably get a new student, right? Like a rehab would be a new student.
I get a rehab project. It depends on the day and it depends on the month where I'll have someone who's coming back from something. I usually don't get to see anyone until like they've failed like 5 other places. They're like, all right, let's go to this wacko over here.
The wizard. We heard this guy.
Let's go to this bizarre dude who won't align himself with any 3-letter acronym.
I'm not even going to go into like screens.
Well, I think you can screen. I have no problem with any screen you want to do. It's just, what's your representative movement lens going to tell you from it? Because if you're just going to tell me that's a motor control problem or a stability problem, then I would just say like, all right, good luck. Go for it.
The people out there that's saying if you can't externally rotate your right shoulder, you can't shallow the club. I prove that tenfold the other way. Like I can't do that and I shallow the shit out of it.
Yeah, because when I check my shoulder external rotation in one position there, like that's not actually what's happening in the swing. It's like we look at absolute joint positions and not understanding that that's not the reality. For example, everyone went nuts in baseball for like horizontal abduction. They're like, oh, the hardest throwers have the most horizontal abduction at like front foot strike. So then everyone started doing I's, T's, and Y's. And then I need to get as much horizontal abduction as possible in order to create more velocity. But it's not horizontal abduction. It's my rib cage is going forward. My arm is holding in the position. So it's like really internal rotation.
Oh.
It's actually a twist. Top of turnaround, like when I'm at the top of my swing and I turn around, that's not shoulder external rotation when I'm starting to turn around. It's actually an internally rotated system that's twisting on itself.
Oof.
We have to look at the time and place of where the turn is occurring. Is my shoulder externally rotated? Yes, but relative to what and at the time? Because actually the connective tissue is twisting into the other direction. So that's why, like, I don't care if you look at shoulder ER. You should look at shoulder ER, but you have to think about it in a contextual representation of space and time when I'm moving, because we're silly putty. I can pull it very slow. The moment I yank on it, it gets really stiff. So it actually changes the way that it's going to be represented in the movement.
That's why the best screen is just watching them hit balls.
That's why I say, like, what have you done the most of?
How are they moving when they're moving? That's kind of my deal. Then I do a couple screens. I'll do some TPI stuff, but a lot of times they go completely against what I think they can do, and they surprise me. People can rotate their pelvis when they think they can't, when they have back trouble. I see it every day with my older demographic. It's just they almost have to give themselves permission to do it and understand it's not going to hurt their back.
Yeah, a fear avoidance thing will kill any movement, right? If I'm afraid to do something, right?
Yeah.
I saw a video of someone doing like a wellness swing coach, I think, talking about like, I always do these movement screens. It's just like a hip quarter rotation test, right? And I see that this guy has great hip rotation. And I watch him rotate his hips. I'm like, there's not a lick of rotation coming from his hip there.
Yeah.
That's all spine. And that's fine, but that's not hip rotation. That is entire system twisting. And again, I don't give a shit. That's fine. But you're not looking at hip rotation at that point. This stuff is tricky. You put someone on their back, and I checked traditional like hip external and hip internal rotation at like 90 degrees. So a traditional hip ER and IR position, right? Say the guy has a huge amount of hip external rotation, but he's got no hip internal rotation. That is just a socket orientation position. That doesn't mean that I need to stretch this and strengthen this. How does it compare to the other side? And then you have to look at stuff like, does he have a straight leg raise, right? If he doesn't, then you know where things are closed. Like if you're measuring a right hip, you're not just measuring a right hip. You're actually measuring what the left hip is doing at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They're not individual, because if I IR his left hip, so I tell him to turn his left hip in, and I go to measure his right hip ER, it might completely disappear because every time I was measuring his hip, he was just rolling on me and I couldn't feel it. you can't take it separate. You have to think about the whole thing.
I love it. We got a few more minutes here. Let me give you a couple of personal development questions. I know you're well read. We've talked about books. What's the book that you've most gifted or have greatly affected your life?
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
I've read that. That was
Have you?
so weird. Yes.
That's one of my all-time favorites. I always feel like I come back to read that book every couple years, every year or so.
So what did you take from that book? I'm curious because I just recently read it.
Just the dive into truth and reality. I mean, it's sort of like a book of travel. And then now being a father and having a child and literally being on a trip with them. And to me, it becomes more personal having that perspective when you look at it. I read the book as a senior in high school. An English teacher gifted it to me. And then it seems like every 3 or 4 years or maybe earlier, like every couple of years, I'll reread that.
Cool. What else? Any others?
Oh, gosh, off the top of my head, let me think about this. Well, there's a book called Seeking Wisdom. It's basically like a bunch of Darwin and Charles Munger quotes. It's a bunch of like Charlie's Berkshire, what's his name?
Berkshire Hathaway, yeah.
Yeah.
That was his assistant, right? Or his right-hand man.
Yeah, he's got a couple of things on there. And I use it as a principle all the time. It's like, if I were to screw this situation up, what exactly would I do? How could I not be stupid?
I love it.
Because if you could really avoid that, it's like, all right, then I did a halfway decent job. And then you can kind of go from there. But there's a bunch of 3-4 page little writings in that book that I think are always worthwhile. You can open that thing in anywhere and check that out.
That's great.
What else? The Fourth Phase of Water. It's just a book basically on how water is misunderstood.
That's like your bio right now.
Yeah, I think that's cool.
Awesome. Those are great recommendations. I'm definitely going to check the Munger one out. That's come up on several podcasts and shows that I've listened to. Seeking Wisdom. Go check that one out.
Great book. Yeah.
All right. So name a failure or roadblock in your life that set you up for later success.
I've left jobs, sometimes maybe not on the best terms, partly my fault and partly my employer's fault as well, or the person I was working with. But it all stemmed from like not handling problems when I knew they were a problem and being like, oh, this will work itself out tomorrow. And I think that's what I am trying to do now is that the moment I think something is an issue is not wait to communicate that it's an issue. Like, let's handle this stuff early and often. That would be the mistake I've made. Not a lot in the past, but in the past where I just were like, all right, not wanting to be confrontational about something or not voicing where I think this was an issue.
Yeah, it's good advice.
Handle things right away.
Eat that frog.
Yeah.
If you had to give a TED Talk on something other than your job, what would it be?
What a question. That's the problem. I'm not really great at anything. You've driven with me. I get lost everywhere I go.
You're a horrible driver. You can never be an Uber driver, by the way.
No.
Steve's going to love that one.
I'm a machine navigator. I don't know. I'm not really good at anything else.
That's sad.
Being a good human being. I think besides me joking that I could be a dick or, fun, but being kind and helping people. Is that a TED Talk?
Okay. That's fine. That'll pass for now.
That face didn't seem like it was passing.
Yeah, that's okay. So in the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, habit has most improved your life?
I think just trying to be consistent and what consistency is, right? It's not always having your A game, but being there, showing up. Because the sessions where I'm like, oh, I do not want to work with this person. Or like, oh, I don't want to read. Like, they seem to be the most valuable when you're like, oh, wow, that's a new perspective. I didn't think of something before. Or I really able to help this person, even though I didn't think I was going to be able to. I think so. Essentially just being consistent enough to show up with what you got that day and just giving it best faith effort.
Yeah, being present, right? That's a tough thing. It is in my job when I'm teaching 8-9 hours straight, right? It's like making sure you give the person in front of you the full attention and something that I strive for. I think that's really good. I got one more and then we'll close with our last one and you can give parting shots. But when you feel overwhelmed or unfocused, or have maybe lost your focus temporarily, like we just talked about, like when you get stressed out, what do you do? Are there any tactics that you go to kind of refocus yourself?
Family is always a rock for me. Like my kids, my wife, those sort of things. I've always got a pretty solid rock there that always will be there, right?
Do you bring some of your work home sometimes to like vent? I'm bad about that. My wife probably hates it. But I mean, that's part of it, right?
Yeah, I do some. She works at a hospital, so I listen to her talk about that sort of stuff.
Goes both ways.
Yeah. I mean, I always have this thought, like, I think it was Seinfeld talking about something, and it was like he had this picture of like the Hubble space, like basically it's a picture of like the Hubble spacecraft, right? Or the telescope. And just realizing how insignificant we all are. To me, that's comforting. Some people feel like, oh my God, that's awful. But that's when things get really like, I'm like, you're just a speck. Who gives a shit about you? So might as well enjoy the stuff, yeah. And then being like movement, nature, all those sort of things always will ground you. The combination of that.
You're a super fit guy, and like talk about some of those outlets, like working out, and we talked a little bit about running and whatnot, but like meditation, nothing like that you sort of do.
I guess I would be classically considered like a failed meditator. Like I've gone periods where I've done it pretty well or I've been consistent with it. But what seems to get me locked into a position where I feel like I lose sense of time would be some sort of exercise without headphones in by myself and or something like playing soccer in the backyard with my kids. To me, that's just as meditative as me sitting on a couch with my eyes closed. Still loss of time and being outside of my body, that type of thing. I think it tackles the same purpose for the current time of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's good. All right, last question. Everybody has to answer it. If you had to get a message to the world, billions of people, I've changed the context for the time. Let's say you had to get a group text to the world. The original question is put it on a metaphorical billboard. What would your message be and why? And you can have multiple if you want.
I think it's going to be continue to ask why. When people just repeat jargon.
Don't be a tribe member.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I understand like we all have tribes, right? We all have people that we associate with, but it's just continue to ask why. I mean, I don't know if that's a super great text message.
No, I think it's good. I mean, are any like favorite quotes or anything that you kind of go to or live by?
Any Feynman type quote. Anytime I see something that he wrote, I'm like, oh, that's cool. And they're usually just very simple, half quirky, half funny. Like I like satire. I like things that poke at stuff. I like it when people give me shit. I like that. I like to give and take some stuff because I can take it. And it's fun to go back and forth. The team atmosphere with Barbs.
Absolutely. Well, you're officially, if I can ever afford to pay you, you're going to be on my team, helping my guys. I'm like super thankful that we met and we can hopefully continue to build this relationship. And thank you for all you've done for the coaches that are starting to reach out, right? It's like, I know you're doing some consulting with some of my friends, and I think you're a huge asset to what we're trying to get better at. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. It's sort of, you build your model when you're ready to talk, you're ready to talk. And I think, too many people will step out too soon. And not that I have anywhere near all the answers at all, but I'm trying to do more of is some consulting stuff. I'll be starting like a small blog with one of my buddies, another PT who's like-minded, works more baseball stuff, but we're going to put some stuff together, hopefully, and open that thing up next week. And we're going to get going and try to do more educational stuff.
Awesome. Tell the listeners how they can find you, how they can work with you and follow you on Instagram.
Right now, Instagram. So it's my first name, Mike, MIKE_DPT. It's the worst branding of all time.
We got to work on that. We need to change that. But
yeah, so I should have some announcement of like starting like a Substack blog with my buddy, and then just DM me there. And then I will be starting to put together more and more educational stuff and building some things out, and that'll be released soon with some other swing coaches out in California. So I'm getting going.
Awesome, buddy. Well, I appreciate your time. Keep up the great work. I appreciate you.
Yeah, likewise, dude.
What's up, everyone? Guru back here again with a couple of things before you go. First, big thank you to Dr. K for coming on the show and sharing his story and insights on human movement and all that he does, which is incredible. Please give him a follow on social at Mike_K_DPT. You can follow me on the Twitter as well, or Instagram at Golf Guru TV. Let's get those follows up, man. My Instagram is lacking. I'm putting out some good stuff. Also, check out my website at golfgurutv.net, where you can find videos, articles, and more information on my teaching and coaching. I've just taken back my blog, so there should be a connection here soon. If you have a question or comment about the show, you can email me at golfgurushow@gmail.com or just hit me up on the DM after you follow me on Instagram. That'd be fantastic. Music from today's show is from Kevin MacLeod and Zach Mullet. And also a big shout out to my producer, Joel North, for his incredible work on this episode and future episodes of the Golf Guru Show. And as I always leave you with, my mentor from afar, RIP Mr. Jim Rohn, study, practice, teach, and then pass it on. I'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening.